Welcome once more, loyal souls, to the endless night of the 41st millennium. Here, aboard the vessel of Grimdark Shards, we dare to glimpse the horrors lurking beyond our fragile reality. If your hearts are steeled and your courage unwavering, step forward. In this tale, a single misstep into the immaterium threatens to consume an entire crew, and perhaps your sanity as well. Stand firm or be devoured. But before we embark, I beseech you, pledge your oath to this channel. Subscribe, sound the war bell by clicking that notification icon, and rally your comrades by liking and sharing your darkest fears in the comments. March with us on X at Grimdark Shards, where we chronicle our voyages beyond the veil. Now, steel yourselves, for the Wailing Dark awaits, and it brooks no mercy. The void ship, Lacrimosa Noctis, shaped by centuries of modifications, soared on plasma wakes through the blackness. Her hull bore the scars of a dozen battlefields and a dozen more desperate deals, all under Captain David Sisk's watchful eye. She was a rogue trader vessel, his vessel, and with that came almost unfettered freedom. Yet the threat of ruin forever lurked. They were outbound from the frontier world of Hestus Beta, newly laden with contraband relics from an abandoned Xenos temple. Whispers rumored the artifacts might be heretical. Sisk suspected it himself, but the promise of wealth overshadowed good sense. In the corridors, the air tasted faintly of incense and metallic tang, a typical day aboard a grand old starship that had seen better centuries. In the Lacrimosa Noctis's lavish briefing hall, Captain Sisk stood before his inner circle. Flickering lumen strips revealed their anxious faces. Under the gloom, the captain's features were drawn, his dark eyes rimmed with sleepless shadows. "This route is off the charts," Sisk said, gesturing at a battered star map displayed on a flickering holo projector. Under normal conditions, we'd never attempt such a crossing, but time is a luxury we don't have. He left unspoken the truth. Imperial enforcers had begun sniffing around their profitable dealings, and the only hope of outrunning them was through a treacherous warp lane seldom used by the Navy. Navigator Thalmorden lowered the hood of his ornate cloak, revealing his elongated skull. His third eye, sealed behind a patch of black velvet embroidered with the crest of House Morden, twitched involuntarily. "I have studied that route for days," Morden rasped. "Astropathic storms are raging there. The warp is unsettled. I will do what must be done, but I recommend caution. The Geller field must be well tended." To his left, Enginseer Adept Kiro Theta hovered with mechanical precision, half his face replaced by a polished brass augmentation. His servo arms twitched in time with his words. "Machine spirit resilience is suboptimal," Kiro Theta intoned. "We labor under minimal spare parts. The Geller field generator must not falter, Captain." Medicae Leora Vaudrin merely folded her arms, the tension in her posture betraying her worry. She had already run low on key medical supplies, evidence of the Lacrimosa Noctis's unrelenting voyage from one risky venture to another. "I can manage my infirmary," she said. "But what good is it if we all vanish in the warp?" Armsman Varro Hesk, a towering man with a scarred cheek, fingered the handle of his Laspistol. He was no stranger to combat. Still, talk of turbulent warp routes made his knuckles whiten. "If anything comes crawling out from the shadows, they'll meet my blade," Hesk growled. "We always survive. We will again." Captain Sisk closed his eyes, recalling how fate had already tested them. He had no illusions about the warp's danger, but to remain in real space, cornered by the Imperium for his less than legal activities, was a slow death. A desperate warp jump offered a chance of escape and fortune. He raised his voice. Then let us proceed. All sections to warp stations. Maintain readiness. We jump in 6 hours. Somewhere deep in the ship's bowels, the aging Geller field generator shuddered in uneasy slumber, awaiting the call to shield them against the Immaterium's nightmares. The moment of translation into the warp had always felt like a punch to the soul. Captain Sisk stood on the command throne, flanked by glowing data consoles and half a dozen officers. Alarm klaxons wailed in warning. Navigator Morden, sealed in his specialized spire chamber high above the bridge, guided them through the swirling tides of unreality. On the main view screen, real space flickered away, replaced by luminous fractals of swirling color. For a few heartbeats, all was unnervingly still. Then chaos, a lurch so violent that the entire ship pitched. Crew across the decks cried out. Lightning arcs of raw warp energy danced along the hull. The overhead lumens died, bathing the bridge in red emergency lighting. Geller field power fluctuation, someone shouted. Reactor output spiking to 160%, then dropping. Sisk snarled commands, forcing himself to remain calm. Reroute from secondary lines. Engine seer, get me real-time data. From a crackling Vox link came Cairo Theta's filtered voice. Subcogitators overloading, attempting to resynchronize. The field is holding, but the fluctuations are extreme. In that instant, Navigator Morden's telepathic shriek cut across the bridge loudspeakers. The man's terror-laced voice reverberated. The path is broken. The warp is... There's something reaching out. A second wave of unnatural pressure slammed the ship. Sisk clutched the command throne's armrests. The Lacrimosa Noctis howled like a living beast in agony. He felt an icy dread seep into his very blood. He'd endured rough warp passages before, but never had he felt the hull itself cry out, as if the machine's spirit was in mortal fear. The Geller field stabilized for a moment. We're not dead, Hesk muttered, half to himself. But the warp scream from Morden had not ceased. Over the bridge vox, they could hear the navigator's ragged breathing. Captain, I see. Unlight. The route beyond. It's changing, pulling us deeper, past the edge of mapped Immaterium. A bone-chilling scream echoed through the vox before the feed cut off. A wrenching boom echoed through the hull. The Lacrimosa Noctis buckled, gravity flickering. Runes across the main console flashed from red to black. The entire Geller field readout went blank. A hush of dread ensued. Then in a single thunderous moment, the ship lurched back into real space. The impact flung Sisk forward. He slammed to the deck, bruising his ribs. A final shriek from Morden cut off abruptly as the translator shutters slammed shut around the navigator's bubble chamber. Silence. The warp had spit them out. Somewhere. Sisk pulled himself up and cast his gaze at the forward viewport. What is that? He expected to see a star field. He saw only a black void. No stars, no cosmic dust, just an endless gulf of nothingness. The ship's instruments beeped in confusion. Sensors are not registering any known astral bodies, an officer reported, voice trembling. I can't get a read on the Astronomicon. It's like it doesn't exist here. That dreadful darkness pressed on them like a living presence. Even with the Geller field offline, they could sense the warp's aftertaste. Something was wrong. Hours after emergence, if they still lived, it was a hollow sort of survival. Captain Sisk's immediate priority was to re-establish a stable Geller field. Without it, even real space might not protect them if this region was truly beyond normal space. Engine seer Cairo Theta and the Mechanicus thralls toiled in the generator decks. Meanwhile, Sisk assembled a search team to check the damage across the ship. Medica Vaudran had reported injuries, both from the turbulence and from psychological shock among the crew. Terrors from the partial warp breach lingered in the corridors, like an unseen miasma. The ship's internal layout is changing, Vaudran said quietly when she found Sisk near the cargo holds. I tried to get to the main infirmary using the standard route, but it's as if certain doors have relocated. The passage that leads from E-deck to F-deck is simply gone. Sisk blinked. Gone? Sealed or replaced by a maintenance tunnel that shouldn't be there, she clarified, voice trembling with frustration. I can't explain it. The Geller field glitch must have done more than let in a bit of warp eddy. Hesk joined them, Lazraful slung over his shoulder. Sir, I found crewman Argus wandering the deck, raving about hearing voices in the walls. He wouldn't calm down, so I sedated him. Voices in the walls. Sisk felt a cold trickle of dread. All right, that might just be warp sickness. Keep the security squads in pairs. Nobody walks alone. At the corner, a bulkhead door hissed open. The corridor beyond flickered under half-dead lumens. Strange lumps of piping seemed to have grown across the ceiling, as though the metal had softened and stretched. Sisk set his jaw, forcing calm. He noticed the edges of every surface were subtly warped, as if geometry itself was no longer certain. The Emperor protects, he murmured, more out of reflex than genuine faith. We will hold together. Let's keep moving. Behind him, the corridor lights sparked and dimmed, and he could have sworn something in the walls exhaled a low, rasping breath. Down on the generator deck, the thrum of ancient engines normally provided a reassuring heartbeat to the ship. Now, it was a ragged, a rhythmic pulse. Engine seer Kero Theta hunched over a cluster of flickering hollow screens. Sparse arcs of electricity snapped from open conduits overhead. The air reeked of ozone and something sweeter, like rotting fruit. Captain, your presence here is timely, Kero Theta said without turning, but do not approach too closely. The generator's flux spillage is volatile. Sisk took in the scene. Servitor units lay scattered about, their mechanical limbs twisted at impossible angles. One twitched, its single organic eye spinning. Another stared blankly at the ceiling, repeatedly opening and closing a charred metal hand. What happened? Sisk demanded. A meltdown was imminent. The warp translation was forcibly aborted mid-transit, damaging many systems. I managed to vent sub-level plasma to prevent total meltdown. The Geller field is partially functional. Kero Theta gestured to the large cylindrical apparatus that housed the field's primary generator. Runes glowed sporadically, but it fluctuates. The machine spirit is wounded. It keens. Listen. Sisk heard a faint keening hum from the generator, almost like a sorrowful moan. In the half-lit gloom, coils of metal near the base of the cylinder pulsed as though alive. One coil receded, then protruded again with a wet squelch. Sisk's stomach lurched at the sight. That's impossible. Machinery doesn't behave like that, he muttered. It is neither purely mechanical nor purely organic, replied Kero Theta, voice laced with both reverence and horror. It's as though the warp has impressed a new pattern upon the metal. The boundary between flesh and metal is unraveling. As if to prove the point, a spidery servo arm behind Kero Theta jerked. The engine seer's mechanical limbs seemed to shudder, the plating rippling. Kero Theta hissed in Binharic code, forcibly shutting down the limb's power feed. I can still hold it at bay, he said, but if the corruption spreads, the entire vessel may transform. Sisk swallowed. He was no stranger to the macabre, but the suggestion that the ship itself was warping into something else stoked primal fear. Can you fix it? Strengthen the Geller field so we can attempt another warp jump. I will try, Captain. Yet the geometry of the core has changed. Our tools do not fit the new shapes. I will need time, and perhaps the Emperor's blessing. Sisk nodded, lips tight. The Emperor's blessing. Indeed, they all needed that now. Medicae Leora Vaudrin was losing track of her own footsteps. She had tried 3 different routes from the lower cargo hold to the main medbay. Each time, she ended up in a new corridor that did not correspond to the ship's official deck plan. Finally, she found a medical ward that resembled the Lacrimosa Noctis infirmary. Yet the angles of the ceiling were subtly wrong, the edges bowed like a corridor, half dissolved and rearranged. Stay calm, she told herself, exhaling. I must see to the wounded. She found cots lined up, some holding unconscious crew. A few medical servitors whirred quietly, but their mechanical eyes flickered with glitching red light. Approaching the first patient, Leora realized it was crewman Argus, the man Hesk had sedated. She brushed her gloved hand across his forehead. He was cold, clammy. Then she heard him mumble, his eyes fluttering open. They're in the walls. They want me to join them. Argus whispered, tears forming. All of us, part of the ship. Can you hear them breathing? Leora squeezed his shoulder. Rest. You'll be... A clatter from behind made her spin. One of the med servitors convulsed, its arms jerking. Sparks cascaded from its mechanical scalp. With a horrible scraping sound, the servitor's torso twisted around, and one of its syringes forcibly tore free from the housing, flesh melding with metal. A rattling cough erupted from its half-human throat. Please, please, it gasped. Its biologic portion, presumably lobotomized, should not have been capable of speech. Yet now it cried out with a voice cracked by disuse. Cannot stop. It hurts. Me. Leora's blood went cold. She grabbed a sedative injector from a tray, edging closer. The servitor's head snapped toward her. She saw new lumps forming under its synthetic skin, mechanical rods sprouting like bones. The stench of burning flesh overcame her. Omnissiah preserve us, she breathed. She sank the injector into the servitor's upper chest. It jerked violently, letting out a final strangled shriek. The lumps under its skin twitched, then seemed to deflate. The servitor collapsed, eyes rolling back, fluid pooling around it in a rancid swirl of blood and lubricants. Leora found herself trembling, mind reeling from the sheer impossibility of what she'd just witnessed. I cannot handle this alone, she murmured. Somewhere outside the infirmary, a pipe hissed. The sound resembled a human sigh, too lifelike to be a standard vent discharge. Then it died away, leaving Leora with only the flicker of lumen strips and the ragged breathing of her patients. Captain Sisk, accompanied by armsman Hesk, forced open the heavy blast door leading to Navigator Morden's private spire. Normally sealed off to protect the Navigator's unique physiology from distractions, the chamber lay in deep gloom. A single, pulsing lumen at the apex flickered like a dying star. The twisting walkway to the spire's central dais was treacherous. Warped plating jutted in hazardously sharp angles. The dais itself, typically an ornate dais with star charts and warp sensors, was in disarray. Carved cherubs that once lined the walls had melted into dribbling lumps of stone or metal. Morden, Sisk called. No answer. They found the Navigator's harness, a complex seat linking him to the warp site instrumentation, completely torn from its mount. The cables lay across the floor, some snapped, others fused to lumps of fleshy matter that shouldn't be there. Hesk lifted his hand lamp, shining it over sticky smears. Blood, he said, subdued. Closer inspection revealed blackish fluid splattered on the walls. Human blood turned that color when heavily oxygen-starved. but there was also thick tar-like discharge that stank of the warp. "Look, Captain." Hesk aimed his lamp at a corner. Morden lay slumped against a battered console, robes drenched in his own fluids. One of his legs twisted unnaturally behind him. Sisk rushed over, kneeling by the Navigator. The man's chest still rose and fell, albeit weakly. Morden's third eye covering was askew, exposing a glimpse of the unnatural orb. Sisk quickly slid the covering back in place to prevent any accidental psychic feedback. "Morden, can you hear me?" Sisk asked, pressing gently against the Navigator's shoulders. The Navigator gave a rattling cough, flecks of black spittle dotting his lips. "Captain, I saw it. The path was shattered. We broke the warp, or it broke us." He groaned, eyes rolling. "There's more than just emptiness here." His hand clawed at Sisk's arm. "Something latched onto us. Not a demon, not the usual. It's rewriting the ship. I feel it in my mind, in my bones." His voice sank to a hoarse whisper. "The walls. They're hungry." Hesk's gaze darted around. "We'll get you help," he said, but he sounded uncertain. Morden clutched Sisk's sleeve. "I tried to steer us out, but the warp spat us into this null space. The Geller field. Partial meltdown. We're stranded, trapped, and it is feeding." Sisk squeezed Morden's shoulder. "Rest. Leora will come. She's the best medici." Morden's eyes fluttered. "They want you to hope. So, you'll stay longer?" He coughed again, sagging, voice cracking with despair. "You must sever the tie, or we become it." A final exhalation, wet and ragged, slipped from Morden's lips. His entire body stiffened, then fell limp. Hesk closed the Navigator's eyes, mouth set in a grim line. "Emperor's mercy," Sisk murmured. Another wave of guilt battered him. Morden had risked everything for him. This whole fiasco was on Sisk's shoulders. "Captain," Hesk said quietly, "we should return to the bridge. We can't stay here." A sudden scraping noise made them both whirl. Something slithered along the dais floor, an elongated ripple under the metal plating. The deck itself bulged, as though a shapeless mass pressed up from below. Sisk and Hesk scrambled back, hearts pounding. The bulge receded, leaving behind twisted plating that glistened with a thin sheen of fluid. "What in Throne's name?" Hesk breathed. But there was no time for answers. They fled the spire, leaving Navigator Morden's body in the gloom. Back on the bridge, battered survivors reported more sightings of the ship's corridors shifting. Some swore they heard breathing or moaning coming from the bulkheads. In 2 cases, entire squads had disappeared entirely. No remains, no voxes, just gone. Striding to the helm, Sisk demanded a status update. "Where are we exactly? Are we even in real space?" A ragged officer consulted a glitching console. "Coordinates are meaningless. The exterior sensors see only a void without stars. Our navigator is gone. We can't attempt a normal warp jump, not with the Geller field in its current state. The warp route we took was unstable. There's no telling how to re-enter without Morden." Engine Seer Cairo Theta strode onto the bridge, servo arms twitching, his Mechanicus cowl stained with dark fluids. "Captain," he said, "the ship is changing more rapidly. I've tried to correct the Geller field, but it's as though the vessel itself resists my repairs. The deck plating pulsates, the cables rewire themselves. The warp corruption is not just infecting the machine, it is forging a new entity." All eyes fell on Cairo Theta. Fear welled up. "You must be joking," hissed an officer. "No, The Lacrimosa Noctis is fusing with something else, the engine seer explained. It might be an extra-dimensional life form using our hull as a womb or a shell. I can only guess. But the transformations are accelerating. If we do nothing, we will be consumed, rearranged as part of this unholy creation. Even as they spoke, Sisk noticed a deck panel near the helm buckle upward, then snap back down. The entire ship gave a low groan, reminiscent of a gigantic beast stirring. Feeding, he thought. We can't just sit idle. Is there a way to destroy whatever's controlling the ship? He paused, remembering Morden's final words. Sever the tie. Cairo Theta's augmetic eye flickered. The apex of the warp corruption appears to be localized in the reactor core. If we sabotage it, it might kill the entire phenomenon. He paused. But that would also kill us if we fail to contain the meltdown. The engine meltdown would reduce us to atoms. Sisk stared at the flickering hollow of the ship layout. Large sections were now darkened or mislabeled, entire decks replaced with unknown shapes. We cannot drift here forever. If that thing is rewriting the ship, it will soon have us anyway. He turned to Hesk, Vordran, and Cairo Theta. We gather a team, make for the reactor core, and see if we can sever the corruption at its source. Then hopefully, we can do an emergency warp jump out. Somehow. Captain Sisk, Medici Vordran, Engine Seer Cairo Theta, Armsman Hesk, and a handful of security troopers formed the assault team. They moved deck by deck, hoping to reach the ship's main reactor deep in the engineering block. No standard route was passable. Twisted corridors forced them into unexplored sections. The deeper they went, the more reality unraveled. Bulkheads gently expanded and contracted as if breathing. Metallic struts gleamed with an organic sheen. The flickering lumen strips overhead gave the impression of a dark artery pulsing with faint light. At intervals, the group found partial remains of crew fused into walls or floors, a hand protruding from metal plating, its fingers twitching in mindless reflex, or a face, slack-jawed, eyes wide in terror, half subsumed into a corridor. Their moans were a silent echo of torment. Emperor, preserve them, Vordran whispered, tears in her eyes. She recognized some faces, engine crew she had once treated for burns. They passed an intersection where a door had grown monstrous hinges. From behind it came scuttling sounds, whispering. Hesk steeled himself, ignoring it. Eventually they emerged into what had once been the high-ceilinged primary engine hall, a chamber typically dominated by towering plasma conduits. Now, it resembled a cathedral of flesh and metal. The walls formed rib-like arches, each arch lined with a slick membrane that occasionally shivered. The floor was spongy, though layered with broken panels, and spears of metal that jutted upward like the teeth of some great beast. In the distance, at the hall's center, throbbed the reactor core. Where once stood an array of mechanical columns, they now saw an immense, pulsing mass of twisted steel and glistening tissue. If the Geller field generator was the soul, this was the beating heart of the new life form. Strands of cables and sinew, barely distinguishable from each other, snaked in and out of the mass, pulsating with rhythmic surges of sickly light. Cairo Theta stared in rapt fascination. This is incredible. The entire reactor has become a biomechanical organ, a new entity. Look at how the plasma conduits bond with living tissue. They are no longer separate. Hesk hefted his shotgun. It needs to die, right? Sisk nodded. The sight compelled both revulsion and awe. Even Vordran, who had witnessed horrors in her time, felt her stomach reel. I can attempt an overload, Cairo Theta muttered, stepping forward. If I can sever specific couplings and force a meltdown, we might annihilate the entire abomination. But if it tries to defend itself, we must hold it off. As if hearing him, the floor trembled. Shapes began to peel away from the walls. Shadows that formed lumps of metal-fused flesh. Shambling things, half-human silhouettes with limbs coiled in steel plating. Some wore the tattered remains of the Lacrimosa Noctis crew uniforms. They advanced with unnatural fluidity, moaning in unison. A hideous choir of the damned. "Weapons free!" roared Sisk. Hesk and the troopers opened fire. Lash shots and slugs tore into the abominations, ripping away chunks of flesh and metal. Some fell, howling, but others scuttled along the walls, ignoring gravity. One pounced onto a trooper, burying a spined limb in his chest. The man screamed, blood spraying across the floor. Vaudrin fired a las pistol, forcing the creature back. She almost gagged as she saw the trooper's body partially fuse with the creature in seconds, the two melding into one thrashing form. "Focus! Hold the line!" Sisk cried, his own pistol blazing. Cairo Theta advanced toward the massive pulsing heart. He chanted Binharic litanies, pulling out a compact data slate. Purple energy crackled around the lumps of living metal. The mass tremored, pulses of warp luminescence traveling up the cables. "I am the voice of the Omnissiah," the engine seer intoned. "In his name, I sever your corruption." One of his servo arms extended a wicked cutting torch. Sparks flew as he sliced into the main plasma couplings. The abominations shrieked as if they felt the pain. The entire chamber quaked. "Hurry!" Sisk yelled, parrying a lunging monstrosity with his chainsword. Cairo Theta severed the next coupling. A gout of superheated plasma roiled forth, scorching the pulsing tissue. The mass withdrew like a wounded animal, lumps of flesh sloughing away. "Overload initiated," Cairo Theta called. "We must get to a safe distance, or we'll be vaporized in the meltdown." But as he withdrew the cutting torch from the final cable, a fleshy tendril erupted from the reactor mass. It speared through Cairo Theta's chest with horrifying speed. The engine seer let out a static-laced gasp. Captain, Omnissiah's will is done," he sputtered. Slowly, impossibly, the tendril yanked him toward the monstrous heart. The rest of the team could only watch in horror as the engine seer was dragged into the roiling mass, his mechanized limbs twitching in final defiance. "No!" Vaudrin cried. She took a step forward, but Sisk grabbed her arm. "It's too late. He triggered the meltdown. We have to run." Even Hesk's grim composure frayed at the sight of Cairo Theta's assimilation. "We can't stay. This whole place will blow." Despite the abominations closing in, Sisk led the survivors in a frantic retreat. Gunfire echoed in the screaming chamber, accompanied by the monstrous roars of the living reactor. The meltdown countdown had begun. The route back was a frenzy. The corridor shifting felt even more violent. Walls rippled, floors rose and fell like ocean swells. Broken pipes spat jets of scalding steam. The vessel was dying, or rebirthing, and it wanted to take all with it. Sisk and Hesk half-dragged Vaudrin, who was limping from a slashing wound. Only a handful of troopers remained, eyes wild with panic. Sheer willpower kept them moving. "We must reach the bridge. Maybe I can forcibly jettison that entire deck, slow the meltdown," Sisk gritted out. "Or get to a savior pod, something." They careened around a half-collapsed corridor. A newly formed bulge in the floor forced them to climb. The plating beneath their hands felt disturbingly warm, as if pumping blood. Leora hissed in pain at the contact. "Captain," she gasped. "My hands—" Sisk looked down. Her gloved hands, cut open, were shifting. The flesh seemed to ripple in sync with the metallic plating. She stifled a scream. "No, no, no. This can't be happening." "Fight it," Sisk insisted. He drew a swathe of bandages from her kit and wrapped her hands. Her tears reflected the horrifying truth. The corruption was in her too. At last, they reached the corridor leading to the bridge. 3 troopers ran ahead. Then a thunderous crash. The corridor floor parted, and from the chasm, elongated metallic limbs emerged, snatching 2 troopers into the darkness. The 3rd trooper fired blindly, only to vanish as well, a strangled shout lost in echo. Sisk, Vaudran, and Hesk were left. The floor sealed again, a hungry mouth that had devoured the men. An unearthly hush fell. "Captain," Hesk muttered, voice trembling with rage, "we can't keep going." Sisk's mind raced. He had one desperate idea. The bridge might be gone, but we can still try the manual override in the dorsal command station. That's separate from the main bridge. If we vent the entire engineering deck, it could buy us time or even jettison the meltdown. Boom! A quake rocked them. The meltdown in the reactor must be nearing. A surge of unnatural energy passed through the corridor, flickering the lights. They pressed on. Miraculously, the dorsal command station was still accessible. The small chamber, used as an emergency fallback, offered partial manual controls. Sisk accessed the console with trembling hands, inputting codes. A grainy pict screen displayed a cross-section of the ship. The reactor deck blinked a furious red, signifying catastrophic meltdown in progress. "We can vent it," Sisk said. "I just need to override the safeties." He typed commands, each keystroke slow and forced. The console spat error messages. Finally, it beeped acceptance. A mechanical voice droned from overhead. "Vox. Vent sequence initialized. Structural integrity compromise will be irreversible. Recommend immediate evacuation." Hesk exhaled in relief. "So we vent the reactor? The meltdown triggers, but hopefully it will just blow out that entire deck, stopping the spread." "That's the plan," Sisk said. He looked to Leora, who slumped against the station's railing. Her bandaged hands pulsed with a faint metallic glimmer beneath the cloth. She seemed half in shock. "Leora, are you with us?" She raised her eyes, tears brimming. "If we do this, will it even matter? The ship, it's alive. It might not let us go." The overhead klaxons blared. 40 seconds to meltdown," the voice intoned calmly. 39, 38. Sisk tried to stand. The deck beneath him throbbed in pulses. "We must reach the nearest escape pods. Their starboard side from here." Hesk nodded. "Let's go." They rushed out of the station, half leading Vaudran. The corridors convulsed. More howls erupted from unseen depths. The meltdown's imminent energy crackled through the vessel. In the distance, enormous tearing sounds signaled that some portion of the ship had begun to rupture. Flickers of blazing plasma glowed from below, as if a volcanic furnace had opened in the lower decks. Time blurred. At last, they found the starboard escape deck, only to see half the pods melted into twisted lumps. A single pod door flickered green, functional. Sisk hammered the console, overriding standard protocols. "Inside now." The 3 of them stumbled in. The door hissed, beginning the automated launch sequence. Alarms rang. The meltdown countdown approached 0. "We might make it," Hesk muttered. But the hiss turned into a screech. The control panel sparked, and the pod door jammed. A wave of scorching heat pressed from behind them. Some corridor meltdown must be flooding the area with lethal plasma. Sisk fought to unjam the door manually. He succeeded in slamming it closed. The pod's engines roared to life, expelling them forcibly into the pitch black outside. Relief crashed over them, briefly. As the pod sealed, Sisk, Hesk, and Vaudran were thrown back into acceleration chairs. Through a grimy porthole, They could see the silhouette of the Lacrimosa Noctis. Parts of the vessel glowed with violent meltdown flares. Sections of hull erupted in gouts of plasmic fire, and yet, the ship still pulsed with that horrible, half-living cadence. "We're free," Hesk breathed. "We did it." Then they realized a deeper horror. Outside the pod's window was a void of absolute black. No stars, no guiding lights, no cosmic dust, just emptiness. The Lacrimosa Noctis glowed like a baleful beacon in that darkness, distant explosions ravaging her hull. But as they drifted away, the swirling mass within the ship's center pulsed brighter, as if it still lived in defiance of any meltdown. Flecks of unnatural light coursed along the remains of the vessel, spreading outward in a fine web. Suddenly, something latched onto the pod. A tendril, thin, ephemeral, shimmering in an oily hue. It sprouted from the Lacrimosa Noctis, bridging the gap. The entire pod shuddered. "No!" Sisk roared, trying the pod thrusters. The control panel shorted out with violent sparks. "It's pulling us back," Vaudran whimpered. She unwrapped her bandaged hand, and they saw the metal infection creeping up her wrist, shifting her flesh. Her eyes brimmed with tears of horror. "I can't stop it." Hesk battered the console in helpless fury. The swirling blackness of space offered no solace. An unstoppable force reeled them back toward the Lacrimosa Noctis. For a final, excruciating instant, they glimpsed the roiling meltdown at the heart of the ship. Yet it did not die. The meltdown's energies churned into a vortex of warp-born corruption, devouring themselves in an endless cycle. "Emperor have mercy," Sisk whispered, as the escape pod's hull buckled. A single star flickered in the distance. The region of emptiness parted like a drawn curtain, revealing normal space beyond. A battered vessel emerged, drifting. It was the Lacrimosa Noctis, or something resembling it. Large swathes of the hull looked restored, but not in any standard Imperial pattern. The plating shimmered with an organic patina, as though grown. The meltdown scarring was gone, replaced by graceful, sinuous lines. Inside, the corridors were silent. Lumens flickered softly. No sign of battle, no sign of meltdown. The air smelled faintly sweet, not the usual stale, recycled tang of an Imperial void ship. Along the passage to the bridge, doors parted smoothly. On the bridge, a lone figure sat in the command throne. He wore a crisp rogue trader uniform, pressed and unsullied. His face was calm, familiar eyes, yet eerily too perfect. It was Captain Davin Sisk, but no trace of the frantic desperation remained. He pressed a control rune on the armrest. "This is Captain Sisk of the Lacrimosa Noctis," he said. His voice was composed, reassuring. "To any Imperial vessel receiving this signal, we are adrift and in need of assistance. Please respond." Outside, a small Imperial patrol ship approached, detecting the distress beacon. Over the Vox, a crackle replied, "This is the destroyer Blade of Faith responding. We read you, Lacrimosa Noctis. We see your hull damage. Stand by for boarding teams to assist." A flicker of a smile crossed Sisk's lips. Behind him, overshadowed by flickering lumens, stood two other figures. One bore an uncanny resemblance to Varro Hesk, albeit standing unnaturally still. The other was a tall female silhouette, possibly Medicae Vaudran. Their features were unnaturally smooth, eyes vacant yet aware. They watched the readouts with an almost predatory calm. "Understood, Blade of Faith. All is well here in the dark," said Sisk. "We welcome you aboard." The occupant in the command throne leaned back, the subtle hum of the living ship resonating with every word. The meltdown had run its course. The new entity had survived. The Lacrimosa Noctis was now a womb for something half metal, half warp, and it hungered for more. Another wave of faint energies rippled across the deck. For a split second, the illusions around Sisk's face flickered, revealing an impossibly elongated grin. And then it was gone. They waited. The boarding party from the Blade of Faith would arrive soon, ready to help. But the moment they stepped aboard, they would discover a labyrinth of corridors that reshaped behind them, sealing them inside an ever-living vessel. Another set of victims, another cycle of assimilation. Silence fell as the final line of Sisk's transmission repeated on a loop. "This is Captain Sisk of the Lacrimosa Noctis. We stand ready to receive you. All is well here in the dark." We have glimpsed a horror beyond mortal ken. Each warp scar and twisted corridor is a testament to what transpires when the boundaries between flesh and machine are undone. The question remains, will you return for more? Arm yourselves with knowledge by subscribing. Your shield in this accursed age. Ignite that icon of notification like a beacon in the void. Commit your thoughts and revelations in the comments below, and rally the faithful on X at Grimdark Shards. If the Emperor's light still shines within you, do not falter. For here, in the endless dark, our stories endure. We are Grimdark Shards, and the warp has only just begun its whispering.